This reminds me of the crowd in Mean Girls at the Mathletes competition. So, I'm going to talk about why research in PICU is so difficult and frame it a little bit around ARDS, since I always get asked to talk about that. But one of the things about pediatric intensive care is most of the drugs we use haven't really been adequately tested in children up to a regulatory level. And that's really out of habit, out of reluctance to commit children to experimental trials, some regulatory authorities, and also problems with IRBs, industry non-interest, and several other reasons. So most of what we do, we don't know what we're doing. So I'll start off just looking at ARDS. So because it's a relatively common syndrome in intensive care, it has a high mortality and morbidity, particularly in some high-risk groups. We think that supportive therapy improves survival, but there's no evidence for any of those alternative therapies that are listed there, which have mostly been studied at some stage. The epidemiology, it makes up about 5 to 10% of ventilated children in pediatric intensive care and accounts for a lot of the deaths in pediatric intensive care. The mortality in adults is probably about 30 to 40%, and in children up to about 35%, particularly with severe ARDS. And so just to look at what clinical trials we've done so far in pediatrics, I'll quickly run through them. Ira's already talked about John Arnold's HFO study, 60 patients. This is a trial by Dobbins looking at nitric oxide, 100 patients, RCT showing no improvement in survival. There was a bit of excitement about Doug Wilson's initial calfactant or exogenous surfactant study, which did show a benefit with exogenous surfactant, but when you broke down the data and looked at the randomization process, there was an imbalance in the immunosuppressed patients, which of course have a high mortality in ARDS. So if you took those patients out or they were more adequately randomized, there would have been no effect. And that's one of the problems with small randomized trials. The follow-up calfactant trial was pulled after 100 patients because of no sign of any signal. And Martha Curley's prone positioning trial, again, it was 100 patients, didn't show any benefit for survival, but you can see there the mortality was so low in this study, probably because of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So what we've learned so far is that stratification and disease definition are critical if you're going to study them. Recruitment is often lower than expected in pediatric trials. Mortality is always lower than we expect when we design trials. And multi-center trials are difficult due to ethics issues, protocol agreement between different regions and sites. Multinational trials are very difficult because of red tape. We saw that with the calfactant study, CARD study. And funding is scarce. And the other important thing about funders is they can really influence the progress of the trial. So both the Cool Kids, which was a traumatic brain injury study from the US that we were all involved in ANZ, and the CARDS trials were pulled by the funders. Whereas if you look at something like Bala Venkatesh's adrenal study, which was published recently, the interim analysis showed no single signal in that study, but because it was an NHMRC funded trial, wasn't dependent on industry funding or for continuation of funding, that trial was allowed to go to the end and did show some benefit with steroids. So we know from evidence in adults that there are positive trials. There's a tidal volume trial, there's PEEP trials, there's a perceiver prone ventilation trial, and some fluid trials, and there's studies like the, Iris has pointed out, the Oscillate and Oscar trial with negative outcomes. So if you have big enough trials, you can probably find some answers in ARDS. But the major hurdles in children are, look, critical illness is less frequent in children. It's difficult to predict onset of many diseases, and they're a heterogeneous group. Even if you look at something like ARDS, which is a single syndrome, the etiology, the underlying chronic disease rate, the clinical outcomes, the clinical course are all so different depending on the heterogeneity of the group. Funding's difficult, always been difficult, although we're getting a bit better with that. Consent processes have moved a bit forward. And the other big question in pediatric studies is what outcomes do you look at? I mean, we're told to look at patient-centered outcomes. Usually we end up looking at ventilator-free days or surrogate outcomes, which, aren't may have some cost issues, but we're dealing with like young children here who've got whole lives ahead of them, and we don't really know where to pitch our trials as far as outcomes go. Just looking at the frequency of diseases, I mean, there's not, in the Western world of developed nations, there's not that many children actually. So if you look at, this is Italy, so similar to European, Australasian countries, no one's having babies. So hardly any children, peak of the population is around 50 to 60. You compare that to Ethiopia, where you've got 70% of the population under 30 years of age, you're going to have a bit more luck with studies. And just to outline the heterogeneity, these are 3 patients with ARDS. So you've got a boy on the left there with who's got had congenital heart disease, pulmonary hypertension, gets a virus, gets into ICU. You've got a patient in the middle, toddler in the middle with meningococcemia, who develops ARDS. You've got the X-ray on the right as a trauma patient. The outcome of these patients is so dependent on the cause of the ARDS that it's very difficult to pitch studies. So how do we overcome these obstacles? I just thought I'd point out just have a look at 2 studies that sort of illustrate the problems that we have. And this first one, this is Andy Wolf's sleep study. So it was a study of clonidine infusion for sedation versus a placebo group, and outcomes were looking at requirements of other sedatives. And they aimed to recruit 1,000 patients over the study period, which I think was probably about 4 years or something like that. Ended up recruiting 129 patients, and the study was stopped after that. And it just shows some of the difficulties you have. So firstly, this was a heterogeneous group of patients. All patients admitted to ICU thought to be ventilated for 24 hours. So you've got different patient groups, different medical teams. There's no ownership of the patients. Consent processes, you had to get consent before they were randomized to the study. So the parents are going, well, he's already on sedatives, why do we want to change things? And there was a reluctance. I think there was 200 refusals out of the, I think they screened about 900 patients. There's 200 refusals by the parents who didn't want to expose any risk or change in management of the child. There was about 350 that were refused by the treating consultant who didn't want to change any process or add any risk. So it just makes things very difficult. And I think the other thing is the intervention was ongoing, so that's a bit harder to get by. And they tried a lot of methods to try and increase recruitment, but didn't. I'll just compare that to the nitric study, which is currently going on in Australia and New Zealand. This is a study of nitric oxide through the pump during cardiopulmonary bypass. And the advantage of this study, this study has ownership. It's owned by the cardiac surgeons, perfusionists, cardiology and intensive care. And they're a group of patients which are managed by all those different teams, all those teams all the time. And the other big thing is consent can be done before the operation, obviously, under less stressful situations. And that's one of the big issues with trying to get prospective consent with children. And this study, it must be one of the few studies that the expected recruitment and the recruitment are almost matching. So, that's a very good, it's very telling, and the recruitment rates are around 70 to 80%. So when we do research, we need a process. And everyone sort of laughs about Donald Rumsfeld's quote there, but, we've got a lot of unknown unknowns, things that we don't know. Well, I have anyway. So the research priorities, we do surveys, we look at expert opinion, look at consumer groups to look at priorities, define and stratify the disease that we're going to study, particularly look at the cost, the morbidity and mortality, then look at retrospective historical data, do observational studies, particularly like cohort studies or point prevalence studies have been useful, and then roll into phase 1, 2 and definitive trials. And that's really the process that we've got to go through. Collaborative groups are part of the answer, and we have now big national regional groups like Polisi, ANZICS, EPSNIC, LARED, PACMAN in Asia, and these are essential in getting people together, looking at bigger numbers and doing successful collaborative trials. We also have to look at successful collaborative groups like the Canadian Trials Group, ANZICS CTG, Polizzi Group, to give examples of how this process is done. So what about money? It's not that much to say. I mean, it's always been difficult. Industry funding is obviously very difficult in children because there's no major financial incentives for the industry groups. But we have had some success recently in both the US and Australia with government grants. Nice grants for Cool Kids, the Prospect study from the NIH in the US, and good success with the NHMRC, ARC in Australia and New Zealand, so with the Nitric, Thrive. So all these studies are starting to gain traction. We're starting to get funding, and that's only going to snowball into more funding, hopefully. We need drivers of research, and that's one of the other problems. We need to say, no, are there questions to answer? We have such a low mortality in overall in intensive care in developed nations, and we need to look at we can't really improve the overall mortality, but we need to look at areas where we can improve mortality. We need protected research time, funded research coordinators, and the College of Intensive Care in Australia have mandated hospital-funded research coordinators as part of their accreditation process, which has actually started to gain a bit of traction in some of the units in Australia and New Zealand. And inclusiveness is important, so people need to feel that it's not the same people getting the same publications for the same work that everyone else is doing, and I think that's a critical part of trying to engage people in research. We've had some progress with ethics and consent. So in Australia, we now have a national mutual acceptance consent process. So consent can go through one organisation, one hospital, one organisation, health centre, and then that can be approved throughout Australia. And that has started to work pretty well, although it took quite a while to get going. We've had success with delayed consent or consent to continue. So if the trial's deemed that it's unlikely to be unsafe, ethics committees have approved that. We had that for the HITBIC trial, which was a traumatic cooling and traumatic brain injury trial in some centres. We had that with the Thrive trial, which is high flow during intubation. The parents are asked for consent in some centres after the intubation takes place. Looking at cluster trials where you have unit consent for an intervention that happens to all the patients in the unit in one intensive care unit for a period is another way of getting over the consent issue. And I won't talk about those problems. And the other big thing is to look at novel approaches, so novel trial designs. And we've heard, everyone's heard about Bayesian theory and platform adaptive trials. And we've looked at different processes in Australia. We've looked at including children as a pre-specified subgroup in adult studies, which hasn't really been successful or taken off. We're now looking at some platform adaptive trials. So the Prospect trial, for instance, is a platform adaptive trial, which just means that you have a set protocol and then interventions are made at different times. So you don't have a control group for each intervention. So an intervention is made to that group of patients for which the set protocol applied for a period, and then that's assessed, and then you can take away that intervention, add in different interventions. So you don't need a one-to-one match control group for each intervention that you use. And with the Prospect trial, that is going to be a reassessment after 400 patients. And then because it's a 2x2 factorial design, the best two performing interventions will be chosen. Randomization will be directed towards those interventions. So it's just a way of making trials more efficient and requiring less numbers. We also have we're proposing a cluster crossover design trial where for diabetic ketoacidosis, where fluids will be given in a unit for a pre-specified time to all the patients, and then it'll cross over to a different fluid, and then we'll look at outcomes overall for different units. And use of registry data and data linkage has been very important in some of the publications we've had recently. I tried to read about Bayesian theory, so I could tell you about it, but I couldn't understand it. But anyway, but essentially this is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, actually demonstrating the Bayesian formula. But essentially, with Bayesian theory, you look at proportional odds analysis at continual periods during a trial. So you can look at what's happened in the trial so far and predict what's going to happen with a certain intervention. And these assessments can be done at more regular periods in a standard interim analysis that is done with a standard RCT. And in that way, you can see if interventions are working, you can take them off, you can add new interventions, and it goes hand in hand with the platform adaptive process. And we'll see how it works with Prospect, but it does make things quite exciting for the future. I just thought I'd go through the Prospect. I mean, Ira's talked all about the Prospect study, but just the process of the Prospect study, just to illustrate how things can work well if they do. And the PICU group was driven by Philippe Jouvet, Neil Thomas, and Doug Wilson. They got together a number of experts. That's me. And to look at ARDS, and firstly to define ARDS. So we put out a new definition and changed a few things around. We looked at the disease in total, looked at a number of recommendations. And what's happened with Prospect is that process first took place, I mean, it was about 2012 when that started. We identified a problem, which was severe ARDS with a high mortality and a group which hasn't really responded well to any treatments that we know of. Then the PICU group looked at research priorities and looked at something that hasn't been studied, as Ira said, HFO and prone ventilation. HFO is being used, but we've got no idea whether it works or not, and there's been some negative trials in adults. Prone ventilation, we know that the Perceiver trial showed a good result, so with big enough numbers, there's potential that prone ventilation could show an outcome. So they were the priorities that we thought. We built a consensus. Funding was obtained from the NIH, and it's very good funding, and looked at a multi-center approach, 50 countries, a multinational approach. There was some input to the protocol from all those centres, and then designed a platform adaptive trial which can look at this two by two design in an efficient manner. And the other good thing about the study, it has a lot of educational priorities, so there's an extensive amount of education to make sure that if we're going to do something, that we know what we're doing it properly, as opposed, for instance, a hi-fi trial in neonates where people were just given an oscillator. No one was told how to use it, and all the babies got intracranial hemorrhage from having low CO2. So in conclusion, research in paediatric critical care is important. They're a vulnerable group. It has a significant, their outcomes have a significant long-term impact on themselves, their family and society in general, and there's a critical lack of evidence in many areas. Research in paediatric critical care is difficult, there's no doubt about that, and collaborative groups may provide some answers. We need to make sure we define and stratify and look at the important outcomes when we're looking at research, and consent processes and novel trial designs are probably going to provide some answers for that. Thank you very much.